On February 24, 1933, gangsters gunned down Dennis Zeigler here in Chicago. Zeigler died in his son's arms. He leaves behind 11 children and his wife, Edna.
I'm Lissa Morgans, and you're listening to Call Edna. Previously on Call Edna.
He was, in the early 30s, I believe, a union man, and the unions were getting started. And he was a hoisting engineer, they called. That was what he did.
And unions in Chicago are facing a particularly difficult dilemma at this time: labor racketeers. If you're not familiar with the term racketeer, it's members of organized crime units and labor unions themselves who siphon union funds towards themselves and their criminal enterprises. And they go one by one. And at this time, they try to take over the union that Zeigler is in. On Friday, February 24th, 1933, a gunman jumps out from behind a tree, shoots Bruce from behind, 3 shots to the head, then flees in a waiting car nearby, described as a black sedan. Edna tells the newspapers that there was a list of men's names that Bruce gave her that if he was ever murdered to give to the police: William Maloney, John Lynch, and Lloyd Little. Episode 2. The List. Hello and welcome back to Call Edna. When we left off, we had Edna's list that she gave the police in 1933 to solve Bruce's murder. I'm sure you're wondering who these men are and what their connection to Bruce is. These 3 men were all involved in organized labor as part of Local 150. First, we have William Maloney, and of the figures, he's by far the most recognizable name because he becomes a national labor figure as the decade progresses. And Local 150 still exists and has a website where they have a history section listing Maloney as the president business manager from 1929 to 1940. At that time, he became a larger figure in the labor industry and moved to Washington, D.C. I'll note that I found a couple of different jobs for Maloney in the executive membership of Local 150 in various newspaper headlines and court documents throughout the years. One actually listed him as the financial treasurer in 1934, but regardless of any small discrepancies, it's clear he's in the executive leadership of Local 150 for the entirety of the 1930s. Then we have John Lynch. He's described as Maloney's shadow. And also, according to Local 150's current website, when Maloney moved to D.C., Lynch stepped into his role, like his literal shadow coming to light, becoming the president and business manager of Local 150 and holding on to that position until 1952. In 1930 itself, he was listed as a business agent. And then we have Lloyd Little. He seems to be the lesser-known figure of the 3, and he's not in the Little About Us history section on 150's website. And in 1930, he's also a business agent with Local 150, along with Lynch and 2 others, Edward Banner and J.W. Tracy. And Bruce alleged that they were illegally involved in his union's takeover. And I quickly found evidence that they were involved in labor racketeering beyond Bruce's union. In 1933, these 3 men from the list were all caught up in a different labor racket called TNT, or the Trucking and Transport Exchange. In December of 1933, a grand jury found that there was extortion of around $500,000 in the Trucking and Transport Exchange, which included conspiracy to boycott some coal dealers and excavators and contract extortion through strikes and other intimidation. And 17 defendants are charged, which is a lot of defendants. And then there's a whopping 35 co-conspirators named. And this is a huge lead because it demonstrates that the men from Edna's list were likely involved in labor racketeering at the time Bruce is murdered. And it also provides us another list of people to be suspicious of, people who could be implicated in labor racketeering in other industries beyond TNT, like Bruce's union. And this is significant because, of course, once it's established that an individual has a propensity for committing a certain type of crime, it's arguable that they may commit it more than once. And I wanted to note that this logic is often used by prosecutors, and in my opinion, pretty unfairly when used against criminal defendants. If you're a lawyer or interested in the law, this is epitomized in the character evidence rule in the Federal Rules of Criminal Procedure, Rule 404. That rule establishes limitations on how character evidence, when it can be used against a criminal defendant and when it cannot be. I mostly find character evidence purely prejudicial to a criminal defendant and not persuasive in determining whether they committed the actual criminal allegations before the court. But I do think when dealing with civil conspiracies, with large sums of money and multiple crimes occurring during the same time period, for it to be much more persuasive. And maybe these men, the 17 defendants and 35 co-conspirators, are potentially involved in Bruce's union as well. But there's one thing I didn't come across when looking at the men from the list. In going through old newspapers and other sources, I didn't ever find that these men were involved in violent crime. They weren't charged with any violent crimes. There's no indication that they would have carried out the hit on Bruce himself. So I wanted to see what leads the police had in 1933, and if there's any connection to these three men. The information on Bruce's murder investigation in 1933 is somewhat limited. I FOIA requested the Chicago police files, but received a response that they don't exist, which I'm not sure is wholly true. I'm certain the person didn't find them, but I know the file existed at one point in time. It has been many years, but according to a March 27, 1943 Chicago Tribune article, quoting, "Police files, resurrected yesterday, showed that statements were taken from several persons, including Zeigler's widow and fellow unionists. They named the men who had threatened him. At the state's attorney's office, no file on the case could be found. Lieutenant Thomas Kelly of the state's attorney police said he couldn't remember much about the murder, except that we questioned a lot of people." End quote. So the police files did exist, and they existed a decade after the murder. And I'll note on that there's another reporter in the 1940s who we'll become more familiar with later. His name is Westbrook Pegler, and he also seems to have the police files or additional information about Bruce's murder. Pegler's papers are kept in the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library, a place that I'll visit later this year and hope to maybe uncover some of these additional police files. But going back to the article, something that immediately stood out to me as someone who worked in the state criminal justice system is that there was nothing on file with the state's attorney's office. And I'm sure prosecution looked very different in the 1930s than it does now, but that means that there wasn't even much of a case for them to build a file off of, or they willingly chose not to build a file. Either way, it made me think about what my grandmother had said, that maybe there was someone on the inside who didn't want to solve Bruce's murder, who wanted it to disappear. So what else do we have? We have the newspaper reporting from the 1930s describing the police's investigation. First off, we have State's Attorney Thomas Courtney instructing the chief investigator, Captain Daniel Gilbert, to arrest Sam Alex for questioning. Starting with Sam Alex, he's a known Capone gunman, as in Al Capone, and he appears to be a classic figure for this time period. He is always getting into trouble for one thing or another. Prior to Bruce's murder in November of 1932, it's noted that he has a record as a safe blower, and after Bruce's murder in September of 1933, there's an article where police walk by a gang fight where Sam Alex is caught, and he also has a shotgun and an outstanding warrant for vagrancy. But something I found interesting in researching Sam Alex is that after Bruce's death, a year later in 1934, he has his first legitimate title that I saw. He was listed as a business agent for the Excavators and Asphalt Teamsters Union, local number 731. Next, we have multiple newspapers nationwide, published from Michigan to D.C., that public enemy number one at the time, Murray Humphreys, and a cousin of Al Capone, Charles Fischetti, were questioned, but that little was learned. Starting with Humphreys, he is also part of Al Capone's outfit. And at one time, he was in fact Capone's assistant, and he allegedly comes up with the idea for labor racketeering, starting in the cleaning and dyeing industry. And he's known to be quite an intellectual. And that kind of makes sense for coming up with the idea for racketeering. It meant he had quite a handle on the business market in Chicago. I was curious what he was up to and what the police would have asked him about from February of 1933. And he was in the newspaper a couple weeks prior, receiving a sentence of 1 year for concealed firearms. So my immediate thought was, well, then was he incarcerated? And he, in fact, was not incarcerated. It seems like that sentence, like many in Capone's unit, were not actually served. The sentence was repudiated, and then he had a series of court continuances. So he wasn't incarcerated at the time of Bruce's murder. And something I found interesting that we'll talk about even more when we zero in on Humphreys himself is that there is an FBI file made public through FOIA request describing what was going on at this time. And it's not just Bruce's murder that Humphreys was wanted on. Quoting from the FBI file, there's an article in the Chicago Tribune on January 13th, 1933, that Humphreys was picked up for questioning in the killing of Ted Newberry, a reported Chicago hoodlum, end quote. So just a couple weeks prior to Bruce's murder, he's picked up and questioned about a different murder. And Bruce's murder is in the file as well. Quoting, an article in the Chicago Tribune on March 7th, 1933, stated that Humphreys, together with Charlie Fischetti, was questioned on the murder of Dennis Zeigler, a labor official, end quote. Noting that Zeigler's name is spelled incorrectly, but it's definitely him, as I found that same March 1933 reporting. And that brings us to Fischetti, who was once Al Capone's chauffeur. And similar to Humphreys, in January of 1933, he's sentenced to 1 year in the House of Correction and fined $300 for carrying a concealed firearm, a crime called gun-toting at the time. And just like Humphreys, and something emblematic about all of these sentences, he doesn't serve this time, so he too is out and not incarcerated at the time of Bruce's murder. Then there are more articles reporting that professional killers from New York killed Bruce. This isn't all that helpful. Many people from Al Capone's world and network are from New York, and it seems a little bit misleading. If their identities are actually known, then why isn't there an arrest for Bruce's murder? But something that stood out is that the three men who were investigated by the police, Humphreys, Fischetti, and Alex, they all have one thing in common, and they have that same thing in common with the men from the list. They were also charged in the TNT labor racketeering case. But this time, we do have evidence of violent conduct on all three's behalf. So, are these the guys involved in the hit? Right off the bat, Humphrey seems a little high up in the organization to be carrying out hits himself, but maybe Sam Alex or Charles Fischetti or another from their network could have been involved. Regardless, we now have a connection between the men on the list and these men. And I wanted to see if there were any further connections with the police officers and state's attorneys who investigated Bruce's murder. And the two police officers involved are Captain Gilbert and Lieutenant Blau. In 1929, Blau becomes the chief of State's Attorney Swanson's police department after the resignation of Thomas O'Malley. In the time period important to Bruce's murder, he's listed as the deputy chief of detectives from 1932 to 1934. And his biggest case was from 1903, the Car Barn Bandits. If you're like me and had no idea what a car barn is, do not worry. Car barns are where streetcars used to be stored at night, and they're manned by city employees. The bandits are notorious for going to different car barns and robbing them, and they commit a couple of murders on the way as well. It could have been up to 12 or maybe even 30 persons, although around 8 seems to be a much safer figure. And how they're eventually caught involves our Lieutenant Blau. On their last crime spree, they decide to go and rob a car barn and they kill one of the city employees. 3 of them approach the car barn and they're wearing masks and hoodies made of old underwear. Even though they get the money from the employee, they decide to shoot and kill them anyway. And then they get away. But Blau gets a tip as to where they're going to be on the night of November 21st. So he decides to get his own patrol together. His squad approaches the bandits, and actually 2 of them get away, but they're able to capture one of them, and Blau apparently strikes him on the head with a pistol in order to subdue him. And the bandit they catch confesses to the crime and implicates his 2 friends. And this is a big headline for Blau. But it's not his only headline involving hitting or punching someone while in the line of duty. There's another story in Prohibition times involving a bar that was selling whiskey. Cops were often paid off by bars so that they wouldn't report them, but Blau couldn't be bought off. So when the patrolmen come back from their investigation and say that there was no whiskey at the bar, he gets a warrant and he goes to the bar to search it. There he encounters a lawyer who's present, maybe because another patrolman tipped them off, and they argue. And apparently Blau hits him with a right hook, then confiscates the alcohol and shuts down the bar. Other than the bandits, Blau didn't have a ton of headlines that caught my eye, so I wanted to see what he was up to in 1933, around the time of Bruce's murder. From that, I found a confession in early February of 1933 that he allegedly obtained about a man who murdered his wife. And almost 2 weeks prior to Bruce's death, on February 13, 1933, he was in court concerning a robbery charge. And then after Bruce's death, on March 17, 1933, he's in the headlines again for arresting someone. He arrests someone who's scheming to get coins out of payphones. And when the man is arrested, he had 18 nickels, 6 dimes, 26 fraudulent nickel slugs, and 1 25-cent slug of no value, which is not really a crime I'm concerned about. Nothing really stands out about the time of Bruce's murder or that he's potentially involved with Capone or organized crime. We have 2 instances of him being proactive as a policeman and trying to seek people out, and we also have a pretty tough-on-crime atmosphere of him arresting someone with low values of money in a scheme to rob payphones. So part of me did do a double take, and I thought, if I was taking bribes from organized crime or otherwise compromised, maybe I would plant headlines in the newspaper to make it look like I was on the right track and that people could trust me. But Blau's headlines didn't really read that way to me. They seemed to be reporting what had actually happened in the incident, and although they stated that Blau had hit someone with a pistol and also punched an attorney, it wasn't in a grandiose, over-the-top way. It was just sort of stating that it happened. I'm not seeing anything to implicate him in Bruce's murder, and I just think he's a law enforcement officer who's of his era. Then we have Captain Daniel Gilbert, who is a dirty cop. I was pretty much tipped off of that right away because he has a nickname. His nickname is Tubbo, And the only other individuals I've come across at this time with a nickname are members of Al Capone's unit. A little background on him. He's selected by Thomas Courtney to be the chief investigator in 1932, and that's where he is at the time of Bruce's murder. Prior to that, he rose through the ranks. In 1917, he was a patrolman. Then he's promoted to sergeant in 1922. He's a lieutenant in 1924, and then captain in 1926. And he serves in that role for 15 years, and he's also assigned to the state's attorney's office as the chief investigator there. So he would have been very important at the time of Bruce's murder. And there are a lot of high-profile cases that he works on in the early 1930s. And truly, when I say all of these cases could be their own podcasts, they could. They're all so interesting, so I'm just going to scratch the surface of them today. So the first one in 1930 is the Lingle case. A Chicago Tribune reporter in 1930, Alfred Lingle, is murdered. And there's something different about his murder than Bruce's, which is that there's a massive reward offered for any information related to his death. Originally, $25,000 is offered, and then it's up to $55,000 by different newspaper entities in Chicago, like the Herald, the Tribune, and the Evening Post. That's a little over $1 million in today's money. And Lingle was shot to death walking in the subway under Michigan Avenue. And Gilbert is one of the first police officers on the scene. Newspapers report that he received word of the shooting and hurried to find Lingle, who he knew personally. And although Lingle seems to be just a newspaper reporter, in the weeks after his murder, it's pretty clear he might be more than that. Immediately, there swirl allegations that he was a bagman, the person who collected or delivered illegal payments for Chicago's Commissioner of Police, William Russell. And he might have been a bagman for other people as well. One of them was a rival to Al Capone, and there's some sort of thought that maybe the rival stepped over the line in some way to anger Capone, and so he took out Lingle in retaliation. But more important to our case is the reporting that happens 2 weeks after the event with some sketchy bank account information and how it relates back to our dear old Captain Gilbert. So Lingle received large sums of money at times. Apparently found in his effects is a canceled check for $500, which is made payable to none other than Captain Gilbert. Considering the allegations that he was a bagman and that he was a newspaper man, if anything else, this is a sketchy check. Fast forwarding ahead to the spring of 1933, just after Bruce's murder, Gilbert is investigating some very high-profile kidnappings. In April, he's investigating the kidnapping of Jerome Factor, who was kidnapped and held for a $50,000 ransom. He was a 19-year-old student at Northwestern University, but was home at the time, and his father is an important figure, John Factor, nicknamed Jake the Barber, who appears to be a notorious swindler, because at this time, he's fighting extradition back to England for allegedly swindling investors out of over $7 million in 1930s money. And he's actually in D.C. discussing extradition before the Supreme Court when his son is kidnapped. Although the newspapers are a little difficult to read, I wanted to read a section of the ransom note that was provided. Quoting, Mr. Jake Factor, if you want your son Jerome home, you will do as you are told. Get $50,000 in old money in small denominations, have it read on short notice. Do not notify police or we send him home in parts. End quote. Jake the Barber says he can't pay the ransom because he doesn't have the money. His finances and otherwise ostentatious lifestyle definitely don't reflect what he's saying, and his son returns 8 days later. But that's not the only kidnapping case involving this family that goes on at this time. In July, Jake the Barber himself is allegedly kidnapped for 12 days. And I'm going to let you in on this now. This kidnapping is fake. And so was the prior one, if you didn't figure it out. Probably because he was trying to fight going back to England. He was doing whatever he could to distract the courts and anyone else otherwise from extradition. So in some ways, he kidnaps himself. But it's very important who he blames for his kidnapping. And that's Roger Toohey. Roger Toohey is one of the known rivals of Al Capone, and Capone hated him. He seemed to be one of the few people Capone was actually afraid of, and Toohey didn't work in Chicago. He was in a northwest suburb, but that didn't stop Capone from wanting him out of his way. So either Capone or some of his associates decided it was time for Toohey to be taken out. But violent hits didn't seem to work against him. As I said, he's not in the city, so he's pretty well protected in his suburb, and he even has police protection from the local officers in the suburb. So Capone and his men get creative, and that's when they decide to say that he kidnapped someone. But they actually try this before Jake the Barber. But he's eventually let off because there is no eyewitness to attest to the kidnapping. Capone and his men knew they needed an eyewitness that would place Toohey taking Jake the Barber. And so they got one. And how they got one is by getting someone to perjure themselves on the stand and say that they had seen something they hadn't seen. And this comes out almost 25 years after Toohey's conviction. That's right. He's convicted of this fake kidnapping primarily because of this eyewitness testimony. And although usually it's not so suspect, false convictions off of eyewitness testimony happen all the time. I mean, it's really persuasive testimony. If someone says they saw something with their own two eyes, as humans, we want to believe them. We want to believe that the things we see, we actually see. But sometimes when you're undergoing an event or a trauma or because of biases of your own, you don't see what you think you're seeing. But in this case, it wasn't a mistake. It was fabricated. And it seems to be that one of the main people involved in this fabrication is Captain Gilbert. And this is why at the beginning I said he was a really dirty cop. Because I think it's one thing to take payments from gangsters at a time during bootlegging when everyone seems to be taking payments. It's quite another to set up someone to perjure themselves on the stand. It's a real obstruction of justice and a real breach to our judicial system. When Toohey eventually applies for a federal habeas petition to review his case in the 1950s, a federal judge, Judge John Barnes, finds that the kidnapping was in fact a hoax that was engineered by Jake the Barber because he didn't want to be extradited back to England. He also finds that the testimony, the eyewitness testimony against Toohey, is clearly perjured. And this is the most important part. The judge says that Captain Gilbert knew and likely had set it up. And he also points the finger at another individual. That would be the state's attorney who prosecuted the case, who should have known as well. And that's Thomas Courtney. We'll get to Thomas Courtney in a few minutes, but I have a couple more things about Gilbert and one about Toohey himself. He seems to be a really interesting figure for this time, and after serving 25 years for a crime he didn't commit, he's released, but he doesn't experience freedom for long. He's only out for a couple of weeks before he's murdered, gunned down on the way to his sister's house. But he did release a memoir called The Stolen Years that is published in 1959. I'm going to do a bonus episode at some point on Toohey and the stolen years because his story is just so interesting. But back to Gilbert, and remember his nickname. In 1941, there's newspaper reporting that there's a Chicago outfit record sheet that gets released, and there's a payment of $4,000 a month, which is about $77,000 in today's money, going to an individual named Tubb. And there's no other individual besides Tubbo or Gilbert who has a nickname anything like this. But he denies that this is him. There's other allegations that Gilbert is also working with Capone's unit. William Drury, who was a sergeant of police under Gilbert from 1932 to 37, commented on Gilbert's relationship with the outfit, saying that the top flight members of Capone's syndicate always seemed to be released quickly after arrest, or if the newspapers had played up the case so much, some sort of fix inside the judicial system. Then there comes the big allegations. In the late 1950s and 60s, after Gilbert's involvement with the Toohey case is revealed, he also is called the richest cop in America. And he has a huge estate. He has a house on Lakeshore Drive and a huge amount of money to his name. And he says it's from gambling and investments. Specifically, money from investments in commodities trading has made him the world's richest cop. But no one buys it. Modern literature seems pretty clear. He was taking payments from Capone and working for the syndicate. And he even has connections to labor. Prior to being a cop, it's possible that he was involved in and controlled 7 Teamsters locals. And after Bruce's death in 1940, he's involved in a bartenders union case involving a man named George McLean. George McLean had been pushed out of his executive office by Capone's outfit, and in response, he got mad. He goes to the press and puts pressure on the state's attorney's office and others to do something about it. And this is when Gilbert and Capone's men get involved. Hours before McLean is supposed to testify regarding what happened to him, Gilbert gives him an official threat from the outfit, warning him that if he testifies, his wife would be abducted, and each day they would cut off one of her body parts, one by one. And there's a cooperation to this story. There's an illegally, obtained FBI listening device picking up on threats involving McLean when they're patrolling Murray Humphreys. And in that recording, Humphreys is bragging about getting McLean to take the fifth and saying that he was going to slowly torture his wife to death. And this is our first account of Humphreys bragging about something violent. Maybe not the intellectual brainiac I had painted him in the beginning of this episode, but with the possibility to be violent as needed. And time catches up to Captain Gilbert. In the 1950s, he's blamed for a lot of failures of the Chicago Police Department that went on during his reign, and when he runs to be sheriff, he's defeated. And as it relates to Bruce, I think it's pretty obvious that he's in a position of power and had the connections to help fix a case, and he would have helped fix it on behalf of someone involved in Capone's syndicate. So, once again, all the individuals that we had thought about before, Sam Alex, Murray Humphreys, Charles Fischetti, he could have helped out any of these individuals if they had been involved in Bruce's murder. But it takes more than a police officer to fix a case. And that's where we get to the state's attorneys who are involved in this case. We have Thomas Courtney and Thomas Kelly. I'm actually going to start with Thomas Kelly because there's really not much on him at this time. He seems to be a relatively junior member of the state's attorney's office in 1933 and doesn't really have very many headlines. And of the headlines that involve him in the late 1930s, specifically from 1937 to 39, nothing really looks all that suspicious. It seems to be the typical crimes that were going on in Chicago at that time. In one, he's investigating a crime ring involving Bugs Moran on fake checks. And shout out to the listener who heard me say Bug Moran instead of Bugs Moran in the last episode. I do have a cat named Bug, so absolutely where that came from. In 1937, he's reportedly working on cracking down on bribes and raids a gambling resort. And then in 1939, he's part of a team that raids Al Capone's brother's lounge, looking for clues related to the murder of Edward O'Hare. And that brings us to Thomas Courtney. He's the other half to the Gilbert machine. Some background on him: he's from Chicago and served in the state senate from 1927 to 1933, and then as a Cook County state's attorney beginning in 1933, right as Bruce's murder takes place. And his career doesn't end after the 30s. In 1945, he becomes a local judge on the Circuit Court of Cook County, and he serves there for an additional 20 to 30 years. So although he doesn't have a national career that takes off, which is his clear ambition, his otherwise suspicious behavior doesn't catch up to him as he sits in the judiciary for a long time. And I'll note that he's a complicated figure. Less complicated in our eyes because we have the benefit of looking at his actions after his death. But overall, he can be described as politically ambitious. His main objective was to further his own political career, and he found the perfect avenue to do so, and that was fighting labor racketeering. It would be hard to cover everything, but a couple of examples of the way he moved are that he'd love getting headlines but not actually convict anyone of anything involving labor racketeering. The first instance of this is in the cleaning and dyeing industry, where he begins an investigation in the mid-1920s with price fixing and collusion in that industry. However, when it goes to trial in 1933, all of the defendants are acquitted. He's also the lead prosecutor in the TNT case I mentioned earlier in this episode, which will have a similar fate. And he gets involved in a really interesting jurisdictional fight between two Teamsters groups in the 1930s, the Chicago Teamsters and the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, who are backed by the American Federation of Labor. And similar in the way that labor racketeers wanted to consolidate power, it kind of seems like Courtney does the same. He helps broker an amalgamation between these two Chicago unions to fall underneath the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, along with Captain Daniel Gilbert. And Courtney gained legitimacy by brokering this type of amalgamation, because not only did he get to pick what organization he wanted to back, he gained political power in defining what legitimate unionism was and what racketeering was at this time. And this is really important because racketeering is considered somewhat of a political slur at this time, and there's a lot of debate over what the best form of unionism looks like. And so by brokering this amalgamation between these two groups, not only is he consolidating power in his own favor, he's also extending his power into future endeavors where he gets to decide what unions look like in Chicago and who they're going to report to. And this leads to another thing that's important about Courtney, is although he runs on this reform platform, it's clearly illusory, and he never prosecutes a member of the outfit and achieves a result against them. And it's believed that this lack of success was 100% intentional, and it's because of his personal ties to Capone. And in looking for more ties to Capone, something that stood out to me is actually back in the Toohey case itself. And that's what his attorney said in opening statements at that time, because it was just so true. And people thought it was sensational. And looking at it in our modern eyes, it couldn't be more of a direct explanation of what was going on. In his opening statement, William Scott Stewart, attorney for Toohey, said, quoting, "The syndicate tried every method in the world to force Toohey out of his territory. When that was unsuccessful, they began to accuse the Tooheys of everything criminal that happened. The syndicate had made inroads also in the government offices, the police department, and the prosecutor's office." End quote. This sums it up for me. The prosecutor's office under Courtney is clearly working in a corrupt fashion. The police department under Gilbert is doing the same, and I'm sure there's many examples of other individuals in government offices helping perpetuate this narrative. And in learning this, I'm not surprised that Bruce's murder wasn't solved. And I'd like to describe this time in Chicago as lawless. And it's not because of the bootlegging economy of the 1920s or what Capone is up to, but because of individuals like Courtney and Gilbert, who are clearly adding corruption into the organized system of government, the system of justice that is supposed to comport due process and fairness and uphold constitutional rights. And so it mattered who you were when you committed a type of crime as opposed to the crime committed. And that kind of leverage, in my opinion, leads to a lawless society. It leads to one where you can't guarantee that you're going to get your due process. Or you could look at it another way. Maybe due process will eventually happen, but you might have to wait 25 years like Roger Toohey for it to happen. And even then, weeks later, it could be taken away. As I learned more about Courtney and the others during this time period, it became clear to me that there were individuals in place who could decide not to solve Bruce's murder officially. But I'm wondering if they solved it unofficially. And my guess is yes. As you know, the police had spent a lot of money and time and resources protecting Bruce at his union headquarters and his house in 18 months from 1931 to 1932 prior to this murder. I think they knew who was after him, and I think they solved his murder in February of 1933. But they didn't tell anyone. So what are our next steps? This episode has left us with a lot. We have suspects, the 3 men from the list as part of Local 150, the 3 members of Al Capone's unit, and now we have 1 cop and 1 state's attorney who seem suspicious. And I want to know their connection to Bruce and his union in the 1930s. And that's what we'll cover on the next episode, in The Brotherhood. But before we go, there's one piece of information I haven't told you yet. And that's that there is a violent threat that I found from 2 of the members on the list towards Bruce. It seems to be one of the only stories recovered from Bruce's journal. And that's that William Maloney and John Lynch made a threat against his life in February of 1932, a year before Bruce's death. We'll find out what happened and what was going on in Bruce's union next time.